Hello, everyone. What is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah, and I am your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way, you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. And with that being said, you guys, happy Halloween. We are officially on the last day of our Halloweek series. If you are just tuning in, you probably would not know that for the past 4 days leading up to Halloween, we have been posting a true crime Killer Instinct episode every single day leading up to today, Halloween, and here we are. I was so excited to see how excited you guys were knowing that Halloweek was coming back. I know we didn't do it last year, and bringing it back this year was a little bit of a question mark up until fairly recently, and so announcing that we were doing Halloweek again and seeing how excited all of you were about it and how supportive you've been, not only just for Halloweek, but in general, it really does mean the world to me. So I just want to say thank you again for allowing me to do this and for listening in week after week, and I hope you have enjoyed Halloweek. And with that being said, we are closing out Halloweek today with a case that left one man being coined as the man who killed Halloween. Today, we are talking about the senseless and brutal murder of Timothy O'Bryan. And with that being said, let's jump right on into it. Timothy O'Bryan was born on April 5th, 1966 in Deer Park, Texas, to his parents, Ronald and Daneen. Now, Deer Park was a middle-class suburb of Houston, Texas, and Ronald, Timothy's father, worked as an optician. This is someone who fits eyewear for glasses and contacts for those who need it. Now, along with that, Ronald also served as a deacon at the Baptist church. He sang in the choir as well, and from those who knew him, he was described as a good Christian man. He was a loving father, and he was someone who was a model citizen in the community. Now, Timothy was an older brother. He had a younger sister who was 3 years younger than him, named Elizabeth, and together, this family of four really did seem like your well-rounded, all-American family. But unfortunately, things were not as good as they seemed behind closed doors. Now, the reality of the O'Bryan family was that Ronald O'Bryan was in massive, massive debt, and he had a mountain of financial hardships. Not only did Ronald have a substantial amount of debt, but he also really struggled with keeping a job. Over a 10-year period, Ronald had been employed by over 21 different companies, and he had been fired from each one of those, whether that was for fraudulent behavior or negligence. He lost each of those jobs. Now, like I said, at this time, he was working as an optician at Texas State Optical, and again, that was in 1974. But rumor had it that Ronald was about to lose his 22nd job because Texas State Optical was actually on the cusp of firing Ronald for stealing money. So his financial hardships were only about to get worse. Now, as far as Ronald's salary, he earned $150 a week, but again, this was in 1974. That would equate to about $959 today. Now, at the time, that was barely enough for Ronald to just cover the basic necessities like rent and food. It was nowhere near the amount that Ronald would need to pay off his credit card debt and support his family long term. Now, all in all, Ronald had accumulated over $100,000 in debt at that time. He had missed over 8 months of his car payments. He had taken out several loans for the bank. Again, they seemed like a very wholesome, grounded, well-rounded family. It seemed like they had a bright future ahead of them, and they never appeared on the outside like there was any struggle going on behind closed doors. But it also was unclear how much Ronald had let his family in, especially Daneen, on the struggles that he was facing. The children were obviously younger and they didn't have an understanding on what was really going on from a financial standpoint, nor should they at that time. But as far as Ronald and Daneen, it's not incredibly clear how much she was in the know about how steep their financial struggles really were. From the outside looking in, it does seem like Ronald definitely tried to put on a facade to make it seem on the outside like everything was fine, when in reality, again, that was not the case. But this is what brings us to October 31st, 1974, which was again Halloween. Now, with this being Halloween, the day started out full of excitement, especially for Timothy and his sister. The kids were super excited to get their costumes on and go trick or treating later that night with their friends. Timothy was 8 years old and Elizabeth was around 5, so they were excited to go out and do their trick or treating. Now, Dayneen, on the night of Halloween, she had gone to a friend's house and Ronald was going to take the kids trick or treating around the neighborhood. Now, Ronald was also not alone at this time. He decided to pair up with a family friend of his named Jim Bates. Now, Jim also had 2 children, and Ronald and Jim got to talking and decided it would be best for everyone if they just combined their families and went trick or treating together as one group. So it was going to be Ronald, Jim, and then their 4 children collectively. It was Timothy and Elizabeth, and then Jim's other 2 children. So the night began. Trick or treating had started, and all of the kids began walking around Jim's neighborhood, going up to different houses and asking for candy. The night started out like any other Halloween would. But then things did take a shift on one particular house. The group of kids, the 4 of them, Timothy, Elizabeth, and Jim's other 2 kids, they all walked up to this one specific house and banged on the door. However, there was no answer. Now, the lights were off inside of the home, and whether someone just didn't want to answer and didn't want to make it known that they were there, or if someone was actually gone and not in the house, that was unclear at the time. So the kids just took it that they weren't getting any candy from this house, and then they moved on. So all 4 kids continued walking, and Jim followed directly behind the children. Now, Ronald, on the other hand, did stay behind for the next few minutes, but no one thought anything of it. But what was exciting was several minutes later, when Ronald returned, Ronald did not come back empty-handed. To the kids' surprise, Ronald showed them that he had 5 giant pixie sticks. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a pixie stick is a candy that comes in a straw-like tube with a sweet and sour powder inside of it. So Ronald comes back to the children with these 5 pixie sticks, and he told everyone that the neighbor who originally didn't answer for the children did end up opening the door after everyone started walking away and handed Ronald the pixie sticks to give to the kids. So everyone at this point was thrilled. The kids were excited because this meant that they got more candy, they got pixie sticks. Everyone was excited, and they continued on their path of trick or treating. Now, the kids did ask if they could put the pixie sticks into their candy bags, but Ronald said that he would hold onto the pixie sticks himself, and then he would pass out the pixie sticks to the kids once they got home. Now, after some time had passed and trick or treating had come to an end, Ronald, Timothy, Elizabeth, Jim, and his 2 kids all walked back to Jim's home. Now, just like he promised, Ronald did end up passing out the pixie sticks to all 4 of the children, but like I did mention, he had 5 of them, so he ended up giving the 5th to a trick-or-treater who had come by the house. So now all 5 pixie sticks had been passed out, and shortly after this, Ronald took Timothy and Elizabeth back to their home to end the Halloween celebration. Now, once they got back to their home, Ronald told the kids that they would be allowed to pick 1 piece of candy to eat before they went to bed that night. Obviously, both kids were very excited about this. They thought it was a great way for them to close out the Halloween celebration by celebrating with a piece of candy. And Timothy actually chose the pixie stick. Now, initially, he did have trouble trying to open the candy, so Ronald did have to help him. And once Timothy did get the pixie stick open and tried to put the powder into his mouth, he did struggle a little bit. The powder wasn't coming out as quickly or as normally as it typically did. And so Ronald helped him again by taking the pixie stick and rolling it in between his hands to try and loosen up the powder. And this worked. Timothy was able to eat the powder inside of the pixie stick, but immediately after tasting it, Timothy started to complain that the pixie stick, the powder inside of it, it didn't taste good. He said that it really tasted bitter and not how candy was supposed to taste. Now, Ronald really just brushed this off in the moment, and Daneen really didn't seem too concerned about it either. And so, in order to help him wash down this bad taste that was in his mouth, Ronald gave Timothy Kool-Aid to drink to again try and help wash out that bitterness. But not even 1 minute after consuming this candy, Timothy started crying out, saying that his stomach was hurting. Ronald then went to go and check up on Timothy, and that is when he saw Timothy convulsing, gasping for air, and throwing up on the bathroom floor. Now, immediately, Ronald and Daneen did call an ambulance, and Timothy was rushed to the hospital. However, it was too late, and Timothy was dead in less than an hour. When paramedics got there and were transporting Timothy to the hospital, the paramedics asked Ronald what had happened, and that is when he relayed the series of events. He said that Timothy opened the pixie stick, he ate it, and that he immediately felt sick afterwards. He explained the reaction that Timothy had and said that Timothy was complaining that the pixie stick did not taste normal. Now, the Pasadena Police Department did get brought in on this case because Timothy's death was unexpected. He was only 8 years old, and the police needed to understand what exactly happened here to cause his passing. And when the Pasadena police joined in on this case, they called the former prosecutor, Mike Hinton, who then called the chief medical examiner of Harris County. So it was a little bit of a game of telephone. But once they got the chief medical examiner on the phone and explained to him what had happened, the chief medical examiner then asked if they could call down to the morgue and see what Timothy's breath smelled like. Now, initially, no one really understood why the chief medical examiner would be asking this, what was really the purpose of it, what was he looking for in his answer, but nonetheless, they did call down to the morgue and asked what Timothy's breath smelled like. And according to the doctors that were with Timothy in the morgue at the time, it was said that Timothy's breath had a strong scent of almonds. Now, when that information was passed back to the chief medical examiner, he was very confident in that moment that Timothy had died of cyanide poisoning. Now, the autopsy hadn't been done at this point, but when it was, it actually confirmed the medical examiner's suspicions. And the pathologist who performed the autopsy said that Timothy had enough cyanide in his system to kill 2 to 3 grown men. That's how much of it was in his body, and he was only 8 years old. Now, if you don't know, cyanide is one of the most rapid lethal poisons. Its compounds are found in pesticides and plastics and mining. Sometimes it's found in industrial processes like iron and steel production. It is incredibly dangerous and incredibly fatal. Now, when police heard that Timothy had died from cyanide, they quickly tried to track down the 4 other pixie sticks because they knew that that's where this came from. It didn't come from anywhere else. This was not something that Timothy had just picked up. They were confident that the poison came from the powder inside of the pixie stick, and so they needed to track down the other 4. Now, luckily, they did know the location of 3 out of the 4 pixie sticks. They knew that they were with Jim's kids and Elizabeth, and luckily, none of those other kids had eaten the pixie stick. But again, there was that other neighborhood kid who had gotten the other pixie stick, that last pixie stick. But luckily, police were able to track down that specific boy because, again, he was a part of the neighborhood. Jim knew who he was. So the police were able to contact his parents, and they were able to warn them about the pixie stick. And according to the boy's parents, they said that they found the boy actually in bed with the pixie stick clutched into his hands, but he wasn't strong enough to open this pixie stick by himself, which is what ultimately saved his life. Now, you might be asking, why wouldn't he be strong enough to open the pixie stick by himself? Now, that is because that all of the other pixie sticks were stapled shut. So it had appeared that someone had opened the pixie stick and then closed it back up and stapled it to keep it sealed. Now, after examining all the other pixie sticks, it was determined that the top 2 inches of each pixie stick had been replaced with cyanide. So had any of the other children consumed that same pixie stick, they would have also died from this. Now, initially, when looking at this case from a bird's eye view, interview, police did not know what to think. Ronald had explained to them how he had gotten the candy from this house in Jim's neighborhood, so police escorted Ronald back to Jim's neighborhood so he could point out which house the pixie stick came from. However, when they did this, Ronald was confused. He said that he didn't remember which house it was. He also couldn't remember the face of the person who handed him the candy. He said that whoever gave him the candy just emerged from the doorway and handed it to him without saying anything, so Ronald was never able to get a good look at who it was. Now, this story of Ronald really not remembering the house or the person or anything about where he got these pixie sticks, this is what started to raise police's suspicion, and that is when they started to dig a little deeper into Ronald's life, and that is when they discovered the mountain of financial issues that he had, which I explained to you earlier. But what they also learned, along with all of the debt that Ronald had, was that Ronald had taken out life insurance policies on both of his children leading up to Timothy's murder. In January of 1974, Ronald took out a $10,000 life insurance policy for each of his children, for both Timothy and Elizabeth. Now, that $10,000 back in 1974 equates to about $61,000 today. Now, they also learned that 1 month prior to Timothy's death, Ronald took out an additional $20,000, which is equivalent to $123,000. But that's not all, because in the days leading up to Timothy's death, Ronald took out an additional $20,000 on Timothy. Now, police also learned that the morning following Timothy's death, so just one day after he had been killed, it wasn't even 24 hours, Ronald made a phone call to the insurance company to begin the process of collecting the money from the policies that he took out on Timothy. Now, if you're curious to know where Daneen stands in all of this, we will get into that a little bit later, but I do want to say that she did claim to know about the initial $10,000 life insurance policy, and she said that she was hesitant about it. She tried to talk Ronald out of it. She said that they didn't need it, and she tried to advise him against it, but she said that Ronald was just really adamant about it. But she also said that she did not know about the other remaining policies. Now, along with all of this, police also discovered that Ronald had reached out to several chemical companies leading up to Halloween night to inquire about purchasing cyanide. Now, one of the employees said that Ronald had reached out and was almost joking with this employee, asking how much cyanide it would take to kill a person. According to this employee, they also said that Ronald was really only interested in the cheapest form of cyanide. Now, even with this evidence, this new information that police are learning about Ronald's financials and about the cyanide employee and about the life insurance policies, police still wanted to make sure that whoever was living in this home that Ronald claims he got these pixie sticks from, they wanted to clear that base. They wanted to turn over that stone and make sure that whoever lived in that house was not handing out poisonous pixie sticks to children on Halloween. So with this, police really had a very stern conversation with Ronald, and they told Ronald that he needed to remember where he got this candy from. It was pivotal that he remembered where he got the candy from, or else he was going to be responsible for the murder of his son. And when police said this to Ronald, his memory magically jogged and he remembered where he got the pixie sticks. He then took police to the home of one of Jim's neighbors, and that man was a man named Courtney Melvin. Now, Courtney worked in air traffic control at the Houston airport, and when police approached Courtney, they actually arrested him right then and there, and they took him down to the police station to ask further questions. Now, upon learning more about Courtney, this is when they learned that Courtney actually wasn't even home on the night of Halloween. He had a very, very strong alibi, and that alibi is that he was working. Courtney told police that he was working the night of Halloween and didn't even get home until 11 p.m. that night, which was far past the time that all of the kids had stopped trick-or-treating. Now, police were able to confirm Courtney's alibi with not just one or two people, they were able to confirm it with 200 other coworkers of Courtney's that worked at the airport that saw that Courtney was working that night. Now, this meant several things. This meant not only was Ronald Ronald now lying about getting the candy from Courtney's home, but it also strengthened police's suspicion that Ronald was in fact the one that administered the poisonous pixie stick to his own son. Now, even though police were not able to confirm where exactly Ronald got the cyanide from, they were undoubtedly confident that Ronald was responsible for Timothy's death. At this point, Ronald was brought down to the police station by police to administer a polygraph exam. Ronald did take the exam, and the results of it were that he failed it. And ultimately, Ronald was arrested on November 5th, 1974. 5 days after Timothy's death. Now, Ronald was indicted on 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder for the pixie sticks that he did hand out to the rest of the children. But Ronald pled not guilty to all 5 counts against him, and this case went to trial. Now, during Ronald's trial, Daneen did testify. In regards to the life insurance policies, Daneen said, quote, "I tried to discourage him, but he said it was the thing to do. We didn't have that much money," end quote. Daneen then went on to say that on the night that Timothy died, Ronald really did play this part of the grieving father. She said, quote, "He beat the wall and asked questions out loud about why an 8-year-old boy had to die, but I did not see any tears," end quote. Now, Daneen also made a very interesting point, which was that she said that Timothy did not voluntarily choose the pixie stick as his candy of choice the night of Halloween. Like I mentioned, Ronald told the kids that they could pick out a piece of candy to have that night. And according to Daneen, Ronald was actually encouraging Timothy to choose the pixie stick out of all of the other candy that he had. Now, Ronald's sister-in-law and his brother-in-law also took the stand, and they testified that on the day of Timothy's funeral, Ronald was almost bragging about what he was going to do with the life insurance money he collected. He made comments about how he was going to use the money to go on long vacations. And according to them, the manner and tone in which he was speaking about Timothy's death, about his son's death, was very unsettling to them. Now, other suspicious behavior that the prosecution presented was that Ronald had been attending community college classes leading up to Timothy's murder, and Ronald would ask his professor questions about lethal chemicals, specifically asking if cyanide was the most lethal and the most fatal poison. Now, as far as the defense goes, they really just tried to argue that the candy that Timothy had eaten had been tainted by some mysterious Halloween murderer who was trying to poison children on Halloween. And that was pretty much their entire argument. On June 3rd, 1975, it took the jury 46 minutes before coming back with their verdict, which was that Ronald O'Bryan was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his son Timothy and 4 counts of attempted murder. It then took an additional 71 minutes to determine that he should be sentenced to death by electrocution. Now, very shortly after Ronald's sentencing, Daneen did file for divorce and she went on to marry a new man. Now, prior to Ronald's execution, he was being held at O.B. Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas. And according to the officials who worked at this prison, Ronald was very much a loner. He had absolutely no friends because all of the fellow inmates hated him. They despised the fact that he murdered his own child, so he spent the majority of his time by himself and very much disliked. So Ronald did have multiple execution dates, but each date kept getting postponed time and time again because his attorneys would try and appeal his conviction to seek a new trial. But after 4 attempts of pushing back the execution date, the judge finally denied Ronald's request for a new trial, and he was scheduled to be executed on March 31st of 1984. Now, Ronald's last meal consisted of a T-bone steak, French fries, corn, sweet peas, lettuce, and tomato salad, iced tea, saltines, a Boston cream pie, and rolls. Daneen said that prior to Ronald's execution, she was looking forward to, quote, "a brand new beginning. I'm glad it's coming to an end. I don't think that Ronald is sick or an insane person, but he is perverted. It's the end of a nightmare. The slate will be wiped clean and we will get on with our life. I don't hate Ronald. I just feel nothing. My concern during these years have not been for myself, but they have been for my daughter. She has no ties to him. I think she has struggled with that, but she accepts the fact that he intended to kill her too. End quote. And I think that that's something that's not really talked about very much in this case. The fact that Ronald intended to kill not just one of his children, but both of his children. And along with that, he was going to go as far as to kill Jim's kids as well, because both of their pixie sticks had the cyanide in them. And the other neighborhood boy who took the pixie stick. Ronald had intended to murder 5 children. Janine also mentioned that prior to the trial, she would visit Ronald weekly in prison and that he would cry to her and plead that he was innocent. She said that sometimes he could be very convincing, but deep down, she knew that he was lying. Janine also said that she actually believes that she was the initial intended target and was intended to be the original victim. She said that before Timothy's death, Ronald had made an appointment to get her a life insurance policy, but they canceled the appointment because they didn't have enough money to pay the premiums necessary at the time. Ronald was executed on March 31st, 1984, and his last words were, quote, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet it doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask for your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts, I love you one and all." End quote. There were about 300 people who gathered outside the prison for Ronald's execution, and many of them chanted "trick or treat" and threw candy while he was being executed. I do want to mention that when it came down to his actual execution, he did not die by electrocution. He did end up receiving the lethal injection. Now, after his death, Ronald has been coined, like I said in the beginning, as the man who killed Halloween and the Candy Man. But the reality of the fact is that Ronald is a man who murdered his own son. But I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say about this case, so please let me know in the comments below. And with that being said, you guys, that's the end of Halloweek. We did it. Happy Halloween. I hope you guys have enjoyed Halloweek. I know that I have. And again, I just want to say one big thank you once more to all of you for listening and for all of your support, because it truly does mean the world. And with that being said, you guys, that is all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I'm your host. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe and happy Halloween. Bye, guys.